Good morning, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. I found it fascinating yesterday, finding about all sorts of different things. I'm a psychologist by background, so slightly daunted to talk about linguistics to a linguistics conference, so please don't be too upset if I make mistakes, but do let me know. So I'm going to talk about morphology, and I think in different areas people use the word morphology for different things. So I'm going to talk about what I mean by morphology in linguistics term and why we thought it might be useful to think about in literacy acquisition. Give a little bit of examples about what young children know about morphology, and then talk about my research in terms of individual differences, and particularly struggling readers or children at risk of reading difficulties, and what they know about morphology and how to use morphology in reading and spelling. And finally, I'm going to finish up by talking about some very recent pilot work I've been doing looking at how we can put morphology into school curriculum. Okay, so a morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit in a word, and it has a parallel with phonology for those of us working in psycholinguistics and literacy, in that a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that can change a word meaning. A morpheme is a unit of meaning, so sometimes that's a whole word. So here we've got the so not use the mouse pointer maybe, but we've got the word dogs, which has a word dog within it, and then that's one morpheme. It's got another morpheme, which is the plural suffix s. That's an inflectional morpheme, so that's a morpheme that can carry information about grammatical information about, for example, tense and plurality. You can also have derivational morphemes, which can change a part of speech or change the meaning of a word. So, for example, in the word interrupt, there's a prefix inter, meaning between, and rupt is a root which roughly means to break open. So interrupt is to break in between something. Rupt is one of those roots that you think of as not being very common, and people say, well, why would I want to learn that? But there are quite a few different words that include that word pattern, rupt. And of course, there are different ways that it could potentially be spelt, but it's always spelt the same way in all these different words. So part of the reason that we really started looking at morphology in literacy is because the writing system in English is morphophonological. So it preserves morphological regularities in addition to phonological regularities. And you probably know, all of you, that spelling and writing in English is quite hard. It's quite an opaque language. I'm not sure this has come out very well on the screen, I'm afraid. This is a letter from a little boy to a tooth fairy. It says, "Sorry, I have swallowed my tooth. Please give me a 2 pennies next time. One of my teeth fell out." Unfortunately, you can't quite see the word, I think, but there's swallowed there. He's spelt swallowed in a way that is absolutely phonetically accurate, S-W-O-L-O-D-E. But it's not the correct way to spell it, and that's because it's a morphologically complex word. So the way you work out how to spell swallowed is to know how to spell the root part swallow and then add an ed ending. So if you know those rules, then you can work out how to spell swallowed even if you've never written it down before. So part of the usefulness of having for morphological knowledge is that it can help you with your spelling. It can also help you with working out the meanings of new words, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So to be able to use morphology accurately, you'd need to have some vocabulary knowledge, so you have to know that swallowed is related to swallow, know the rules about spelling affixes, and know the spelling of the root word. So this slide really says the same kind of thing in a slightly different way. English morphology is relatively transparent, and English phonology is not very transparent. So for example, the words jumped, rolled, and hunted all end with a different sound. So jumped ends with a t sound, rolled ends with a d, and hunted ends with an id. But they're all spelt the same way. They're spelt ed, and that's because they're all past tense morphemes. Similarly, you get the same with the plural morpheme s, so you get cats and dogs ends with a z sound, and horses, but you spell them all the same way with an s, because it's all the same morpheme. You can also, as I said, use English morphology to produce new words. So my example, which is getting a bit out of date now, is ungoogleable. If someone says to you something's ungoogleable, you know what they mean, even if you've never heard the word before. But so, for example, if you know what the word rain means, you can work out what the word rainwater means, or rainy or rained, fairly easily. So you can learn a lot more words if you have these root words and understand how the morphological system works. And we know that children do understand how the morphological system works, at least in terms of oral morphology. So, for example, again, I think this hasn't come out very well, but these are some examples from my own children. That's what happens if you have a parent who's a psycholinguist. They scan in all your spellings and things. So this is an exercise that my son had to do when he was 6, where he had to put 2 words together and work out what the meaning of the new word would be. So you can see he's got eye coat, a coat that's shaped like an eye, or dish dog, a dog that helps you do the dishes. So he can work, with compound words, even at 6, children are quite capable of working out how the compound word system works and what happens when you put words together. However, you can see he's not necessarily learnt the morphological spelling rules. He's spelling shaped with a T like it sounds, and dishes with an I. So you can understand how words combine to make new meanings, but doesn't necessarily understand how spelling represents morphology. And this is an oral example from my 3-year-old daughter. If you're going to Leamington, this is where you want to go to buy lemons. Go to Leamington to buy lemons. And these are just some more examples. So here, I am witchy because I am a witch. You can see this child has been consistent about their spelling of the word witch in witchy here. So they've shown some understanding. Whereas here, this is the same girl, Libby, who's, this is supposed to be harder. She's spelt hard correctly, but she's not known the affix spelling. So she's spelt harder. This is, in case you're interested. You can tell that I love children's spellings. I saw a butterfly up in the sky. I tried to catch it, but it flew too high. And I tried harder, but it flew too high. I did not catch a butterfly. It's like a little poem. Okay, so we've seen that children have some understanding of morphology in oral language and in some beginnings of understanding it in written language. Probably many of you know that we've been testing children's awareness of morphology for many years. So Jean Berko is the person who came up with the WUG test, and this is an example from her WUG test. So the idea here is that you're giving children brand new words, they've never heard this word before. Can they use it in morphologically complex ways? So this is a WUG, now there are 2 of them, here are 2, and 4 to 6-year-old children will quite happily say, here are 2 WUGs. And that shows that they're not just relying on past experience of words they've encountered, they can actually use morphology productively in new situations. So a lot of what we do is looking at versions of this kind of WUG test. So looking at it with real words, here's 1 cat, here are 2 cats. With nonsense words like WUG, which, as I say, show you whether it's productive knowledge. With not just obviously with plurals, but with past tense, yesterday he jumped. And also with non-words and more complex things. So the cat was the most gringy, it was the gringiest cat. And children are pretty good at each of these kinds of things. More recently, we've been using a dynamic morphological awareness task. And the reason we do this is because we want to see if the children can't do the task straight away, how much help do they need to be able to understand the task? And that gives us an idea of kind of how shaky their knowledge is. It gives us a bit more of a sensitive measure. So in this one, we, again, this is an example from Burko's WUG test. This man's job is to zib. What do you call someone whose job is to zib? Anyone? What do you call someone whose job is to zib? Zibber, yeah. But if they didn't get that, we give them a real-world example and talk them through that to see how much explicit support with the real-world example they need. So this woman's job is to bake. She's a baker. What do people do when it's their job? We add a sound on, and so on. So if the child got it here, they'd get, they'd need 0 prompts. Here, they've needed 6 prompts. Here, they're just literally repeating zibber. So those are the kinds of tasks that we use to look at morphological awareness. And I'll talk more about some different kinds of tasks that we use to look at morphological strategy use later. Okay, so I said I'd talk about individual differences and my own research. So this study that we completed a couple of years ago was a comparison of children with dyslexia or struggling readers and children with a history of otitis media, which is repeated ear infections. We were interested in whether those children with otitis media showed reading difficulties, and particularly whether the 2 groups of children showed the same types of phonological difficulties. So we know that children with reading difficulties tend to show phonological difficulties. We know that children with otitis media tend to show phonological difficulties. We didn't necessarily know how similar those difficulties were. But the other key aspect of this project was looking at to what extent these 2 groups of children could use morphological information to help them progress in literacy. So a little bit of background about the children with otitis media. I'm not going to talk about them very much at all today, but just to give you a bit of background about why we wanted to look at this group. So ear infections are very common in preschool children. About 80% of children will have at least one in the preschool years. But some children have repeated ear infections. And they can have glue ear, they might have grommets, which are little tubes put in to help drain the ear, kind of mucousy fluid stuff from the ear. They might, as a result of these infections or the grommets and so on, have scar tissue in their ear, which can somewhat affect their hearing. A minority of them have some long-term hearing loss, generally in the mild or possibly moderate range. Generally speaking, these children will have had reduced or impaired phonological input in the preschool years during the time when they're having the greatest language acquisition. So the theory is that they have relatively weaker phonological skills because of those impairments during the time they were acquiring their phonology. Typically, what you find with these children is they show relatively poor phonological skills, but actually they don't necessarily have reading difficulties. And that's why this group is particularly interesting for us, because dyslexic children tend to show phonological difficulties and obviously reading difficulties. So if there's a group of children who've got phonological difficulties but don't show reading difficulties, we'd quite like to know why and what's protecting them from having reading difficulties. So that was the kind of logic of why we had these groups. And this is just to show you the groups we had. So we've got these dyslexic. I'm afraid I'm not very consistent about whether I call them dyslexic or poor readers. I was supposed to go through and change it all to poor readers, but I obviously haven't. So dyslexic or poor readers, and they are selected to be at least a year delayed in their reading. And we match them to two control groups, chronological age controls, who are typically developing children at the same age. So you can see they're matched on age. And then we also match them to reading age controls, who are younger children who are typically developing, who are at the same reading age. So the reason for doing this is to look at whether the difficulties that the dyslexic children show are unusual given their stage of reading. So we can look at whether it's unusual given their age, but it might just be because they've had less reading experience. That could cause difficulties in other areas. So the reading age match controls provides another control for that. So we did the same thing with the children with otitis media. So we've got chronological age match controls, and we've got reading age match controls. So they're individually matched on reading age. But you can see that the children with otitis media are actually reading at the level you'd expect for their age. So the reading age match controls are not very much younger. The other thing that you can see from this chart, if you're interested, is that the dyslexic poor readers had poor spelling. So this is a standard score of 84, where 100 is average, whereas the children with otitis media were very close to average. So I said I wasn't going to talk very much about the children with otitis media, and I think this might be the last slide about them. Just to say, we carried out some standard phonological awareness tasks, and some static tasks and some dynamic tasks. So those are the same kinds of tasks as the dynamic morphological awareness task I showed you, where we set them quite a hard question and give them increasing levels of support. So on those dynamic tasks, higher scores are bad because that's more prompts you've needed. The children with otitis media showed, as we expected, poorer phonological awareness than their chronological age controls and their reading match controls. And they showed slightly poorer scores on the dynamic phonological awareness task. But on all the morphology tasks, they looked absolutely in line with their matched controls. So they didn't show any difficulties in morphological tasks. But they did have some specific difficulties in the phonological tasks. And then the children with dyslexia showed a very similar, well, quite a similar pattern to the OM children on phonological awareness. They're poorer than their matched controls, and they need more prompts than their matched controls here, though it's not significantly worse than reading age matched controls. And then they show that same pattern again on the morphological tasks. So they are impaired on the morphological tasks just like they are on the phonological tasks, whereas the children with otitis media are just impaired on the phonological tasks. So there's a different profile overall, and possibly that's associated with a different profile in reading. So just to sum up that so far, the children with a history of otitis media showed weaker phonological skills, but they've got average reading and morphological skills. And the children with dyslexia or reading difficulties have morphological impairments similar to their phonological impairments. So we shouldn't assume that morphological awareness is unimpaired in dyslexia or struggling readers. And that's something that some people have argued, that because we know these children have phonological difficulties, what we should do is try and teach them morphologically rather than phonologically. But in fact, they seem to show that same profile of difficulties on the morphological tasks. So the next set of tasks that I'm going to talk about are where we looked at what these children are actually doing in reading and spelling tasks. So the tasks I've talked about so far have been trying to look at oral language. So the children don't have anything written down, they're just hearing it all. The next set of tasks actually look at written language. So the first one is a short-term memory task for written words, and then I've got a non-word spelling task using morphological rules. So the short-term memory task, hopefully I've set this up that you can have a go at the short-term memory task yourselves. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so just remember these words. So you get that list, and then you get a probe. Did the list include the word bees? Some yeses and some no's, which is exactly what we want. In fact, it doesn't include the word bees, but it does include the word bee. So the idea is, how confused do you get between bees and bee? So we had we had that list of words that came up, and then the probe verbs, and we have 4 different conditions in that probe word. It could either be, like the bees bee situation, something that had a morphological overlap. So that it had post, and the probe was postal, or it could be what we call a pseudo-morphological overlap. And this is where it's got the same amount of overlap, but it's not actually from the same morphological root. So met and metal have the same amount of overlap as post and postal, but met and metal don't overlap in meaning. So these letters up here, which I should have written out properly, M stands for morphological overlap, O and P stands for orthographic and phonological overlap. So met and metal are spelt the same way and sound the same way, so they have an orthographic and phonological overlap, but they don't have a semantic overlap, so the S is for semantic. So a true morphological overlap has both semantic overlap, it has a similar meaning as in post and postal, and an orthographic and phonological overlap, so that you write them the same way and spell them the same way. Pseudo-morphological just has that orthographic and phonological. And then we also had a semantic overlap, so it didn't look at all like the target. So you might have had all as a target and then get everyone as a probe. And so it has the same amount of semantic overlap. It kind of means the same thing, but it doesn't have the orthographic overlap. And then we had unrelated overlap, so something that's nothing to do with anything in the list. And our hypothesis was that as you go down this list, they're more confusable. So the morphological ones are most confusing. You're most likely to make errors there. Pseudo-morphological, a bit less confusing. Semantic, less confusing. And unrelated, not very confusing at all, relatively easy. But it depends on how you're doing the morphology. If the morphology to you is just about kind of letter overlap, then metal would be equally confusing as post-postal. If it's just about semantics, then everyone might be equally confusing. So these are the results from the dyslexic children, and their matched controls. So this is D prime sensitivity, basically how often they said yes, it was there, but no when it wasn't there. So you can see unrelated is highest in all the groups. Overall, the chronological age match controls are highest, and they showed the kind of pattern we expected. So the morphological ones are hardest, and the pseudo-morphological and semantic ones are in the middle, and unrelated are easiest. The reading age controls actually show a different kind of pattern. For them, the morphological and the pseudo-morphological are equally hard, and then the semantic and unrelated are a bit easier. So that suggests they're not really relying much on meaning, that the post-postal and met-metal are equally as confusing for them. They're maybe just going on the letters and sounds, less about the meaning. And then the dyslexic children actually show quite a different pattern. They show this massive gap between the morphological items and the pseudo-morphological items. So this is one of the few places where they look quite different from the reading age match controls. So the younger children can't tell the difference between morphemes and pseudomorphemes. The dyslexic children really, really can. And they're also finding the morphemic overlap very confusing. So they're really very likely to say yes to the B's B probe. So this took a little bit of puzzling about. I think what we can say is that, yes, the dyslexic students are sensitive to morphology, but they find it very difficult to use, or they find it very confusing. It's kind of overwhelmingly confusing, maybe. And they're not working at in the same kind of way as younger, typically developing children. The next task where we tried to look at morphology in written language was about non-word spelling. And in this task, we have words matched on phonological structure, and we have a sentence context that gives clues as to the morphological structure and therefore the spelling. So here, the control words, you don't really have a clue. The two girls hacks in the park. Well, you do have a clue, but it's not morphologically complex. And the second one, she called her pet rat Poma. In the morphological items, we set up a situation where it's a multi-morphemic word. So the two girls dack in the park, one has to go home, so the other girl dacks alone. In that case, you would expect there to be an S on as a marker of that part of speech. A person who soams is a soma. So you can see these words rhyme with the control words, so they have very similar phonological structure, but you should spell them differently because you can tell that they've got that morphological structure from the sentence. So our question was, how sensitive are different groups of children to this? And these are some more examples of the words we used. So the gringiest I used as an oral example earlier. Dreeped. So I think this is one of the easiest and this is one of the hardest. The first one was, so what we would do is read it out loud so they could hear the word and then had to decide how to write it down. So the first one was quite gend, but the next one was even gender. And the interesting thing with this one is that there's a silent H in that gend, and that root word is right there in the sentence. So if they understand root constancy, they should put that silent H in the gender. The man tried to kiss a bird. So we had both inflections and derivations, things like salty, saltiness. You can see these are related to real words, lagic, logician, She wouldn't jaw sit with him. There was no point in having the jawtion. So in many of these cases, so with jawtion, there's different ways you can spell that, or sound. We've chosen OR, and again, they should transfer that to the spelling as a morphologically complex word. So the first thing we looked at was the phonetics. How often do they just correctly, because it's a non-word, there are different ways you could spell it, and what we would expect people to do is sound it out and represent each of those sounds. So how often do children in each of the groups correctly provide some kind of correct representation for each of the sounds? You can see that the dyslexic children do that about 40% of the time, which is similar but marginally less than the reading age match controls and significantly less than the chronological age match controls. So they are more likely to make phonological errors, which is what we'd expect because we know they've got phonological difficulties. In terms of how often they use suffixes, we also showed a different kind of pattern. So here, what you're looking for is that there's a big difference between the control and the complex. So for the inflections, on the CA controls, I haven't got my point there, I keep finding it and losing it. On the CA group, there's big difference between control inflection, HACs, and complex inflection, DACs. So they are making a lot of, that means that they are spelling those two things in different ways, which is what they should do because one is morphologically complex, one isn't. And same with the derivations. There's quite a big difference between the control and the complex, and they're really sensitive to using the morphological context to guide their spelling. The younger reading age match controls are less sensitive to that, so there's a smaller gap between the complex and the controls for them. And in fact, there's no significant difference on the derivations. So they found those derivations basically too hard. They were just using phonological strategies. And that's exactly what you see with the dyslexic children as well. If anything, they've got a slightly smaller effect on the inflections as well. So they were not very likely to use morphological information to guide their spelling. They looked very much like younger typical controls. So we don't really have a straightforward answer to how much the struggling readers are using morphological strategies. We know that they are sensitive to morphological information because they find it really confusing in memory, but they aren't necessarily using it to guide their spelling. There's not much evidence of them using it to guide their suffix spelling, and not much evidence. They look similar to younger children of the same reading age, and they don't use it very much at all in derivations. So this leads on to the last part of my talk, which, as I said, is very new. We felt that these findings showed us that struggling readers could be taught how to use morphology, but that you would have to do it quite carefully because they were finding it quite confusing. They weren't necessarily using it spontaneously. And similarly, that's what the experience tells us. So a lot of specialist dyslexia teachers will say that they use morphological information, morphological strategies to help their teaching. We also know that it's a very common strategy to use with deaf children who have a much reduced access to phonological structure of words. But we showed in the previous study that the type of phonological impairment isn't necessarily the same with the struggling readers. There was a meta-analysis carried out looking at morphological interventions mainly in America, which did suggest that it is moderately effective, particularly for students with speech and language problems, which often co-occur with literacy problems. And it seemed to be particularly useful for comprehension and spelling. So we felt that really what we wanted to do is try and apply what we'd learned, was think about how we could bring morphological teaching into schools. Kate kind of alluded to at the beginning that the extent to which children are taught about the structure of words has varied in across the last 30, 40 years, probably across education ever. But since 2014, children are given a certain amount of information about morphology in terms of prefixes, suffixes, root words and compound words. They're not necessarily taught rules about what prefixes and suffixes mean or how words combine, but they are taught to break them up. This is in the primary school national curriculum. In secondary school, there's not this kind of guidance on how children should be taught spelling or grammar. So we were particularly interested in how this works in secondary school. And we got together with a company called a company called Trugs, who run a program called Aris Literacy, which is an online program to try and support vocabulary learning across secondary schools. The idea is that each teacher picks up to 30 vocabulary words for each topic they're teaching, and we provide information to the teachers about which words are going to be more difficult, and in particular which children are likely to have difficulties with which words. And we do that by linking up to the school information management system, which will have the children's, which classes they're in and what their reading ages are, and then we create vocabulary sheets for each child. So the words are ordered in phonics difficulty. So this is an example from a topic on Sikhism, which I picked slightly because some of these words might be unfamiliar to you, which sometimes helps you think about the difficulties in reading them. So some of these are relatively unfamiliar but really easy to decode, like cash or kirpan. Some of these words are familiar but relatively difficult to spell, like beliefs. For each child this is ordered in phonics difficulty, and there's a line and there's a note that says, above this line we think you can work out these words yourself, but below the line you might need some extra help. And the children are supposed to read them, tick off when they can read them confidently, and write down the definition. So we've decided to extend this. This is just based on phonics, but of course most typically developing children in secondary school have got phonics sorted out. They know how to sound out words. So we wanted to look at whether we could provide morphological information. So for example, with that Sikhism topic, there are words like interpretation, practice, reasoning, Sikhism itself, symbolise, and worship that we could break down into what we've called combining words rather than root words, because, well, for various reasons, and affixes, so prefixes and suffixes. So interpretation has inter in it, it has pret as a kind of combining word, and that has ation, which is, again, a derivation that changes the part of speech. So we provide that information. What we've provided for the children was a list which gave those combining words, the affixes, and then also gave some examples of related words containing either the same combining word or same suffix, and then some false friends, which were supposed to be words that look similar but don't have a shared meaning, to try and get them to focus in on the true morphemes and how you can tell a true morpheme. We had, as I'm sure you can imagine, some issues to consider. So as soon as you start trying to do this, you start thinking, well, what is a morpheme? And, you know, it turns out people argue about morphemes and where morpheme boundaries is, what should count as a root, which is part of the reason we've gone with combining word as a term. We also wonder to what extent we should break things down. So should we focus on the most productive morphemes? Should we break it down into each separate morpheme? So for example, if we have globalization, we could break that down into globe and owl and eyes and Asian. Or we could break it down into global and ization, or and that's something we still need to think about. To what extent is it useful? So sometimes I think it's useful. The Pret interpretation is an example where it might not be very useful. It doesn't necessarily carry much meaning. And Pret has at least 4 different definitions. But maybe it's useful to break the other parts off. Similarly, in school, children are supposed to learn about different parts of speech, but don't necessarily. And sometimes morphemes do change spelling, even though I've said they don't. Like worship and worth, deep and depth. So we carried out this pilot work. We decided to focus on year 8, which is second year in secondary school. The reasoning being that students are settled in school, teachers know them, but they're not doing the GCSE syllabus yet. We had 3 schools. We've tested the kids. I haven't analysed that yet, but we've had some teacher and student focus groups, and really the overwhelming response from that is, I've made it too complicated. I need to make it a lot more simple. So I think what we'll be doing from now on is just showing how to break down the words. Not talking about false friends, not talking about related words. So that's been really useful to, I think from a kind of psycholinguist point of view, you kind of think, this is so interesting, people want to know more, where actually year 8 children want to know as much as they need to know. So, just to sum up, I think the children understand morphological knowledge from an early age, and they understand how morphemes carry meaning and can be combined to create new meanings. Other aspects are slower to develop, particularly how morphological spelling rules work. We could be more explicit about how we teach those in school. And struggling readers are sensitive to morphological information, but they tend to find it quite confusing, and they tend not to use it to guide their spelling. So when we're teaching morphological strategies, we really need to think about how we can be simple and structured and clear in providing guidance. And that's something that I'm thinking very much about at the moment and how to do that. So any ideas, thoughts would be very useful. Just to say thank you very much to all of you for listening, all my collaborators, particularly Helen Bredmore, who was a co-investigator on the big grant that formed the basis of most of this talk. Obviously the teachers and parents and schools, and the funders, and yeah, we've got a little bit of time left for questions. Thank you.
So I'm going to be coughing my way through. That was fantastic. I've decided I've got a slight dyslexic thing, and the B thing was like, yes, nailed it. You nailed it. That was amazing. We have got some time for questions. That was beautifully timed, actually, Julia, and incredibly clear. It's lovely when someone's so clear.
Thank you.
Questions, comments? Yes.
I was interested. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was interested in why you were thinking of avoiding the term dyslexic, and I noticed during the talk, I think interchangeably, forgive me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
you were using dyslexic, poor readers, and struggling readers. And I wondered if you'd like to say more about which of these you favour ultimately, and why you may be sceptical about using the term dyslexic.
Well, in this particular study, originally we were, the children haven't all been diagnosed with dyslexia, so they have been selected on the basis of having poor reading, so really I should call them poor readers. I've kind of got into the habit of calling them dyslexics, but reviewers have pointed out I should call them poor readers, so I'm kind of trying to use that term. I think from a research point of view, we tend to think of poor readers or struggling readers as dyslexic students and use it fairly interchangeably, but of course in the school world that those are very different groups, and teachers can often be quite reticent for you to use the term dyslexia. And particularly in Warwickshire, when we were carrying out this work, there was a lot of controversy about the term dyslexia. So I've tried to hold back from using it, but it is my kind of background to use it, I guess.
Any other questions? Sorry, I haven't got the mic. It seems to have gone for a run. Sorry, yes. Thanks, Laurie. I have two questions, but I think first one, and let's highlight another one. You said at the beginning that English has got quite a transparent morphology, and would you generally say, and this is from the perspective of SLA research, that your approach is most suited to languages with a transparent morphology and not so suited to languages with more challenging, more hidden morphology? Or would you say that your research can't really answer that if you've only done it in English?
I think that's a really interesting question, but I can't really answer it because I have only done it in English. My kind of impression about different languages is that you tend to have they're all obviously different, but it tends to be, if you have a very complex phonological structure, it tends to be, the morphology tends to be relatively transparent, and then if you have a complex morphological structure, the phonology tends to be more simple. So I think you need to think carefully about the characteristics of the individual language and how that would work. So I know, for example, Finnish has quite a long morphological structure, but it's very transparent anyway phonologically, so it's relatively easy to sound it out. And you would therefore probably not rely too much on morphology because you just don't need to. Yeah. So.
Can I ask the other one? This is for understanding. In the task that you gave them for creating morphology, all the examples that you put there were phonetically quite difficult. So they had a very poor grapheme-phoneme connection, and I wondered whether that was deliberate.
In the spelling task, sorry.
In the task where you created Nonwords and asked them to create morphology.
Yes, we tried to make them. We were trying to make them root words that could be spelt in more than one way, so that they. Yes, it was deliberate to try and get them to use the root that was provided earlier in the sentence. And if you could only spell it one way, we wouldn't be able to tell whether they were using that root or not.
I think we're going to have to close this session because everybody has to get to their next sessions. But can we give Julia a massive round of applause?
Thank you.